Alright, we are back with a new video, and as a follow-up to a video I made last week about the most overrated Survivor winners, I decided to now talk about the top 5 most underrated Survivor winners. Now, I should acknowledge up front that Peridium did make a very similar video like this last week, and it was pretty good, and you should definitely check it out. However, I do have slightly different takes than what that video presented, so hopefully I can explain my points pretty well. And as a similar disclaimer to my overrated Survivor winners, I'm not saying that these players are necessarily the best winners of the game per se. I'm not saying a lot of these players are necessarily great. However, I feel like they just tend to get underrated a lot by the Survivor community. Maybe they've been forgotten about over the course of time, or people just don't give them enough credit where they deserve. So similar to the overrated Survivor winner video, just because a person is on this list doesn't mean that I think that they're necessarily a good or a bad player. This is largely based on how I feel like they are perceived by the Survivor community compared to what I think of them in general. But similar to that, let's get right into the video, and we have some honorable mentions to break down. So the first honorable mention that I have is the winner of Survivor Africa in Ethan Zahn. And I think the main reason Ethan tends to get underrated is when people look back on a season, Survivor Africa, they think of it as the season that proved that nice guys can win Survivor. And in a lot of ways, Ethan does fit that bill, where he was, for the most part, pretty likable. He wasn't seen as super cutthroat, and he was incredibly loyal to Lex to the point where he was willing to take Lex to the end, despite the fact that he probably loses to him had he gone to the end. And a big reason that he was able to win at the end was due to him having a better relationship with Kim Johnson, this nice old lady, who in turn won the Final Immunity Challenge and chose to take him over to the end over Lex. So I think in a lot of ways, Ethan does fulfill this perception of this nice guy and proving that people like that can win a game of Survivor. However, even then, I think people tend to overlook some things about his game, particularly with his involvement in the Silas blindside at the first tribe swap. He recognized the division with the old Samburus and decided to throw the immunity challenge in order to protect the Baram members that were now in the Samburu tribe, and to get Frank and T-Bird on board to vote out Silas, who was largely viewed as the leader of the original Samburu tribe. So I feel like that was a bit of an interesting, innovative gameplay move from Ethan, and not something you would really expect from someone who is generally seen as a nice guy and someone who was largely honor bound at the end of the day. So there's that. However, moving beyond Africa, I think he played relatively well on Survivor All Stars, to where he was one of the last winners remaining from that cast, despite the winners being targeted early on. And he made it decently far, all things considered. So I find that impressive. And even jumping to Winners at War, I mean, yes, he was an early boot there, and a lot of that was due to him being seen as expendable. However, even then, he was pretty effective at aligning with a lot of the old school players, and he was largely seen as pretty likable to the point where people wanted to keep him around. It was more so the fact that they wanted to keep around bigger threats, people like a Boston Rob, that prompted him to be voted out so early in the game. So at the end of the day, I feel like Ethan did get a bit unlucky with how All Stars and Winners at War played out due to circumstances outside his control. And in general, I think people tend to overlook some more strategic elements to his game from his winning season in Africa. However, at the end of the day, I still feel like Ethan is someone who would do well on any given season. That is a big reason why I consider him to be underrated. However, I feel like other players would probably do a bit better. Maybe other players that would definitely utilize their strategic ability more so than Ethan, which is why he is only here as an honorable mention. Next up, we have Natalie White, the winner of Survivor Samoa. And I'm sure if you ask a lot of people who the most underrated Survivor winner is, I'm sure Natalie is bound to make that list, as a lot of people think that she was too hated, and I feel like there was a lot of reassessment of her game in recent years that allowed her to be highly ranked. And I feel like that is largely the reason that she isn't on this list anymore, as I feel like there's a lot of people that have come to recognize some of the merits of Natalie's game. They recognize that she saw Russell as someone that could take all the bullets for her. They recognized that she had decent relationships with a lot of the Glue members after the merge that allowed them to go after each other as opposed to targeting the foe of 4, who were in the minority at that point. And through that, I can't really say that she's underrated anymore. I mean, I don't really see her as overrated per se, unlike Vesepia, who did make my list in my last video. However, I feel like with people recognizing the merits of Natalie's game and with people propping up her game in light of history and people recognizing that Russell's overrated, causing them to improve their assessments of Natalie, I don't really feel like she's as underrated anymore as she probably would have been a couple years ago. However, she was still worthy of an honorable mention here. Next up, we have Sophie Clark, the winner of Survivor South Pacific. And I feel like if this was before Winners at War, she probably would have made the list, in my opinion, as she definitely gets overlooked and a bit forgotten about, as Survivor South Pacific wasn't exactly the most well revered season per se. And when a lot of people think of that season, especially for a while afterwards, they think of Coach and how he dominated the game, or they think about Cochran and how he was such a big character in that season, and obviously came back for Caramoan and won in dominating fashion. And Sophie largely tends to get forgotten about in the grand scheme of things. However, I feel like after Winners at War and how well she played there, people have largely come around to her and recognized her for the great player that she is. And I think that that's great for Sophie, and I'm glad that people are starting to recognize her merits at this point. However, with that in mind, that is a big reason that she is not considered as underrated anymore, as, again, people have come around to seeing her as a great player. And yes, while people may overrate her South Pacific game and give her credit for seeing Coach as a GOAT and for thinking that she was really running things when Coach was just a figurehead, which I don't really agree with, but it's something that people have argued in the past. I feel like I can't really say Sophie is the most underrated at this point. However, like with Natalie, she was at least worthy of an honorable mention here. Next up, we have Denise Stapley, the winner of Survivor Philippines. And Denise was a bit closer to making the list even after Winners at War, as I think Denise tends to get forgotten about, as obviously with Philippines, I mean, yeah, she has the distinction of surviving every tribal council. However, I think when people think of her Philippines game, they tend to think of her working alongside Malcolm, and a lot of people tend to give Malcolm more credit for a lot of the moves that the two of them were making. There's obviously the fact that she didn't have the best relationship with Abby Maria, which got into trouble at points, and there's also the fact that she was willing to take Malcolm to the end in a spot where Malcolm beats her, and it was only through Malcolm making it clear to her that he wouldn't have taken her to the end that prompted her to flip on Malcolm, voting him out at 4, and then winning the game at the end against Lisa Welchel and Redacted. So take that as you will. And I feel like after Winners at War, people are pretty low on her, as well as people, aside from the Sandra move. I mean, she didn't really play that impressive of a game. I mean, she wasn't really in a winning position by the end of it. And through that, I don't really think people see her as that great of a player outside of the Sandra move. However, that's just it. I feel like that causes her to be a bit underrated at the end of the day. I mean, yes, while people do give her credit for the Sandra move, I don't really feel like they give her enough credit for surviving all those tribals in Philippines and her being more involved with working with Malcolm to navigate the post-merge of Philippines. So those are at least considerations for me. However, I just feel like with the game that she played, I feel like it just wasn't enough to consider her the most underrated per se compared to her actual ability as a player. So because of that, I couldn't quite consider her for this list. Next up, we have Ben Driebergen, the winner of HHH. And the main reason he was a consideration was because of how much he's hated by the Survivor community. I mean, people don't like the way that he idled his way to the end of HHH, the fact that he had to rely on forced fire making in order to get to the end. And even on Winners at War, I mean, I know people weren't too happy with him there as well. However, I think Ben isn't that bad of a player. I mean, people tend to forget that he actually had a decent amount of control for a lot of HHH. And similar to another player who did make the list, I mean, yes, while he did get into a bad spot by the end of it, he was at least seen as a big threat who would have won had he gone to the end. And we saw that when he did win after getting to the end, even if the way that he got there was a bit suspect. And even on Winners at War, I mean, yes, while he probably was never winning that season, I still find it impressive how he was able to make a pretty deep run that season, despite him having this reputation of finding idols and potentially being this big of a threat. So that was at least a consideration for me. However, at the end of the day, I feel like there's someone else on this list who is probably better as a player and is someone who Ben has kind of overshadowed with their winning game. So I feel like Ben just didn't quite make the cut for me. In the final honorable mention I'll include here is Erika, the winner of Survivor 41. And Erika was very close to making the list, if you ask me. If this list had been made right after Survivor 41, I feel like there's a very good shot she is on this list. However, the main reason I decided to leave her off is I feel like in recent months, people have come around to her winning game, including myself. I mean, I remember being particularly low on her winning game at the time. However, I feel like as time has passed, we've learned more about the game through deep dive interviews and just rewatching the season. I think Erika does have more merit to her game. I mean, yes, while she wasn't in that great of a position in the pre-merge, and even the post-merge, she didn't have too much control before the Shan vote, I still feel like Erika demonstrated quite a bit of skill as a player, and her being able to be this lamb that turned into a lion. And in turn, I feel like the support for Erika within the community has become more vocal over time, to where, yes, she always had her defenders even at the time of her win. However, I feel like in recent months, the overall conversation of her game has been much more positive, to the point where I can't really consider her that underrated anymore. So yes, while she probably would have made the list had this been directly after 41, I feel like the shift in tone with how people assess her game lead me to leave her off this list of underrated Survivor winners. And with that, we are now moving on to the list of underrated Survivor winners, and this should be pretty interesting to discuss. And I know people may disagree with some of my takes here, but that's just how any of these opinion videos will be. And with that, we'll get right into the list. So starting off at number 5, the 5th most underrated Survivor winner for me is Danni Boatwright, the winner of Survivor Guatemala. And I actually considered her and Erika for this spot here. And again, there was a point where I had Erika at this spot and I had Danni in the honorable mention section, largely due to her Winners at War game, which really highlighted her ability as a modern player. I mean, obviously she didn't do very well in Winners at War, and I feel like through that, they maybe questioned whether she was good enough as a player to be underrated to begin with. Because yes, people don't remember her super well. I mean, she played all the way back in Guatemala, which is a largely forgotten season, largely due to the lack of returnees and the fact that it was so long ago. So I feel like that made me question whether she should be on this list. However, after thinking about some more, I mean, I figured that yes, she did not play Winners at War particularly well. However, I don't really feel like that takes away from her Guatemala game, which was very impressive. I mean, the fact that she was able to play under the radar for a lot of it, which some of that was intentional, given the fact that she didn't reveal her game much to production and confessionals, and the fact that her alliance was largely picked off in the post-merge, led her to be the last person standing, and her building the relationship with Rafe that really allowed her to get into Rafe's corner, to the point where Rafe started to sabotage his game. He's voted out people like Judd and Cindy, weakening his own numbers while making it harder for himself to win at the end, to the point where by the end game he probably only wins against Stephanie, whereas he probably could have taken other people like Judd along, or even Lydia, to the end and won against them pretty easily. But instead, Danni was able to build a good enough relationship with Rafe so that he decides to take her to Final 3 over some of those other people. And in the end, she is able to win Final Immunity, vote out Rafe, and then win in overwhelming fashion against Stephanie, who was seen as like a heroic and popular figure immediately after Palau, but obviously with the way that Stephanie had played on Guatemala made her much less likable and much more villainous in the eyes of these players. So I feel like there's a lot of merit to Danni's game here, in the fact that it came from a season like Guatemala, which is not well remembered and it has been largely forgotten about, especially after Winners at War. I think Danni is still underrated at the end of the day. And yes, while you can question whether she's that great of a player after Winners at War, I think the fact that people overlook a lot of the merits to her Guatemala game and really overlook her season in general is a big reason why she cracked the list for me, and the reason that she is here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and we have someone who I alluded to earlier, but now I'm talking about them we have Mike Holloway, the winner of Survivor Worlds Apart. And again, Mike gets compared a lot to Ben in the sense that they were both these men who were pretty physical and pretty good in the early stages of the game, were leaders for their groups at one point, but then lost control later in the game to where they had to rely on challenges in Mike's case and idols in Ben's case in order to get to the end, and then they win the game due to them being the biggest threat. However, I feel like with Mike, there is a bit more going on with him in terms of him being underrated. For one, I think the fact that Ben came along definitely overshadowed Mike. Definitely people didn't like Mike's win at the time, and they probably still don't to a large degree. And actually, you can argue that Ben's win in HHH made this problem worse in the sense that when people think of Mike, they just lump him in with Ben as these similar winners who had to luck their way to the end. And while overlooking a lot of the details of Mike's game more so than with Ben's game. So that's something at least. Plus, Ben played more recently than Mike, causing Mike to be a bit more forgotten. However, if we're looking at their individual games, I think Mike's game is a bit more impressive outside of the immunity run, where I feel like he had a bit more control over the course of the game, with him being in the majority for a lot of the pre-merge. And yes, while he does single-handedly blow up his game at the auction, he still has a number of allies afterwards. He is able to be the swing vote during the Sierra Dawn Thomas blindside, the final 5. And aside from that, there are people who turn to him as a vote during the rounds where he has immunity. Whereas Ben, I don't feel like had that much control to begin with, especially with Ben playing his idol or one of his idols before the votes are cast, to which basically removes any leverage that idol play might have had. I feel like Mike probably didn't have anything at that level per se. I feel like Mike had more control throughout the game. And plus, with Ben playing more recently, I think Mike tends to get a bit more forgotten about, and while still being lumped in with Ben per se. So I feel like those factors contribute to me thinking that Mike is a bit more underrated than Ben, and in general, underrated in general, which leads me to put him here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and we have a bit of an interesting case to discuss here. This player is a recent winner and someone who played more recently. However, I still feel like this person gets a bit overlooked at the end of the day. But here we have Nick Wilson, the winner of Survivor David versus Goliath. And I think similar to Danni, people kind of soured on Nick after Winners at War. With him not playing that great of a game, he obviously got a bit of a creepy edit per se. And aside from that, he was playing for the bottom for a lot of it. However, I never got the sense that Nick was a bad player per se. He is pretty good at winning challenges. He obviously won several immunity challenges towards the end of David versus Goliath. He's good enough socially to where he has a number of bonds both on David versus Goliath and even on Winners at War that allowed him to avoid being targeted despite him being at the bond for a lot of that game. So I think there's that to consider. And I think strategically he is pretty competent as well, where on David versus Goliath, he was the main orchestrator of the John Hennigan blindside, which is pretty impressive, all things considered. So I think Nick is a pretty good player, all things considered. And I feel like in the grand scheme of things, he is a pretty solid winner. However, I think there are two main things that cause him to be underrated for me. Winners at War wasn't that great for him. It's not particularly great that he got that edit in the sense that people started to see him as this pretty bad player. But also within the game, he was at the bottom, so there's that to consider. And I think the other consideration is that he is less flashy, and I feel like he tends to get forgotten about compared to the winners surrounding him. He came right after pretty notable winners, for lack of a better word, people like Wendell and Ben. And immediately after him is Chris Underwood, who won in a very unconventional fashion. And then afterwards, he gets overshadowed by Tony. So I think in the grand scheme of things, especially in this grouping of modern winners, I think Nick tends to get a bit overlooked in the grand scheme of things, which causes me to see him as an underrated player. And a big reason that he's here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and we actually have a very similar winner to Nick in that they are a modern winner and someone who gets overshadowed by other winners from this era. But here we have Tommy Sheehan, the winner of Island of the Idols. And I think Tommy has a very similar issue to Nick in that he is a relatively boring winner. People were talking about at the time of the season how he was getting this very obvious winner edit, and while they acknowledged that he was playing a good game, and he made some pretty impressive moves on that season. People were pretty underwhelmed with his win because of how foretold it was in the edit. And then also the fact that Island of the Idols is a pretty dark season for obvious reasons. So all of that I feel like makes Tommy a bit forgotten about. And I think people don't like to think much about Island of the Idols very often. However, I feel like Tommy still played a very impressive game on the season where he basically dominated the game from beginning to the end. And he got into some pretty bad situations, like at the swap when Elaine got a block a vote, which causes his side to follow the numbers. After the merge, he gets a very bad tribe and the split tribal where he was the only member of his original tribe there. However, he was able to convince most of the people from that other side to keep him around. So I found that pretty impressive. And then, of course, there was this big move at the Final Four where he convinces Nora to save him from fire, which is very impressive. And obviously, considering how betrayed Laura is when Nora tells her that she's setting her to fire, I think that's pretty impressive that Tommy was able to do that. So I think on the whole, Tommy played a very impressive game, and actually a more impressive game than Nick did on David versus Goliath. However, similar to Nick, I feel like he is suffering from him being seen as a boring winner, of a winner from a season that isn't well liked, and just in general being overshadowed by other winners from this era of the game. So I feel like with that, Tommy is definitely an underrated winner. And I feel like with the disparity between his perception and his actual game ability being wider than than Nick's, I feel like that causes him to be higher on this list of underrated winners. However, I feel like there is one winner who is probably even more underrated than Tommy, which leads me to leave him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the most underrated winner in Survivor history is a bit of a weird pick, considering this person has a particular nickname, but we'll get into that in a moment. But here we have Earl Cole, the winner of Survivor Fiji. And it's kind of weird for me to call someone who is literally known as the King of Fiji as the most underrated winner. However, I feel like there's a couple things going for Earl here. One is that I feel like he played on a season that is not well remembered. He played back in Survivor Fiji, which, yeah, people remember it as the first season with the modern immunity idol and the season with the have-not twist, which is one of the worst twists in the history of Survivor. However, I feel like through that, people tend to not look back on the season particularly well. Also, the fact that there are certain characters in that season that aren't too likable. People don't like Rocky too much. People don't like Lacey too much. In general, outside of Yowman and Earl, this cast isn't super likable at the end of the day. So I feel like through that, people don't look back on the season super well. Plus the fact that it is a mid-school season. It was over 10 years old at this point. So people are unlikely to look back on it anyway, and the people that do aren't gonna look back on it fondly. So I think Earl definitely suffers from that. And the other thing is that Earl, similar to Nick and Tommy, isn't the most interesting winner on the surface. When you think of Earl, you can't really think of a flashy move per se. Outside of, I guess, the safe vote tribal where they sent out Edgardo, but even then, we see that more as a group effort. And actually, Stacy was the one who said, "Why not vote Edgardo?" And they don't really see Earl as the leader of that per se. However, Earl was the leader of that alliance for pretty much the entire game. And really, when we look at his game in general, it's a very smooth ride. He comes in and he really connects with pretty much everyone on his tribe, both his starting tribe, which was the Have Not tribe, which lost all the challenges. And then at the tribe swap, he's able to connect pretty well with Cassandra and Dreams. Now, mind you, a lot of that was due to the fact that he built that bond with them at the very beginning of the game before the tribes were established. However, he was still able to flip them over, with them being at the bottom of the original Moto, and through that he's able to essentially dominate the rest of the game, and no one ever really targets him at any point. So I find that pretty impressive, and in general, he plays this leader figure for his group, and yes, while he doesn't make any flashy moves, he is still playing extremely well and has a lot of control throughout a lot of the game. So I feel like through that, Earl has demonstrated himself to be a very strong winner and a very strong player. And especially with the context that he never even watched Survivor before coming out to play. I mean, he was literally a last second addition. He knew nothing about the game, and yet he was able to come in and just play extremely well. So I think that also adds to the impressiveness of his game. But yet, I mean, people don't really look back on him super well. I mean, even from his era, I mean, people tend to think of, he played Raptor Cook Islands, which had big characters like Yule and Parvati and Ozzy and Penner on it. And then even immediately after, you have China, which is a very well remembered season and has an impressive winner in Todd in it. And I feel like through that, Earl naturally gets pretty forgotten about in that sense as well, despite him being this impressive player. So I feel like the gap between what he demonstrated from his game versus how people remember him and how people regard his season, I feel like it is such a wide gap to where he is an underrated winner and the most underrated winner for me in the history of the show. Now, I can see some people disagree with this take, and I would love to see Earl come back at some point. However, for this list of underrated Survivor winners, I feel like Earl is the most underrated Survivor winner in Survivor history. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. And I do have some more videos like this planned moving forward, so stay tuned for that. We also have Big Brother starting in a couple weeks, so I'm probably going to be doing coverage for that, as well as Survivor South Africa, which should be a very fun season as well. Plenty of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.